Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company might be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and long-time Apple user.
I'm Charlie Sorrell, a writer, nerd, and recently I've mostly been using Firefox.
No way. You're already sabotaging the episode and we haven't even begun yet. Today's episode is in fact about Safari, Apple's built-in web browser. Originally launched in 2003 for macOS 10, today it runs on pretty much every Apple platform with the notable exception of Apple Watch and Apple TV. The iPhone version of Safari was the world's first desktop-class web browser on a mobile device, and the underlying technology that powers Safari, known as WebKit, incredibly now forms the basis of almost every web browser on the market, including Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. In fact, it's really only Charlie's preferred browser, Firefox, which isn't WebKit based these days. Safari might be Apple's most successful app ever, but that certainly didn't seem likely back in 2003 when it launched. Back then, Microsoft dominated the market with a whopping 95% market share for Internet Explorer. So the story of Safari is a David versus Goliath story, which really parallels the rise of Apple itself. So in this episode, we ask the question, how did Safari happen? Before we get into it, as a warm-up, Charlie, I have a trivia question for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so how many Apple kits can you name? And I will get the ball rolling with HealthKit and HomeKit.
Okay, I'll name WebKit.
Most pertinent, any more?
My mind's gone blank now. I do know more. I promise I know more.
ARKit or CloudKit you could have had?
Oh yeah, of course.
And what about cores? How many cores can you name? Like Core Audio.
Oh, Core Audio. Well, let's see. Core Audio. How's that?
That's one.
Core Video.
Yes, that's another.
I can't think of any more.
Core Location would be another example.
Of course.
So,
yeah.
Okay, another question on this, which I've been trying to get my head around. And the reason I'm thinking about cores and kits is, as you touched on, WebKit is very much what we're talking about today, because WebKit is an underlying technology that Safari uses. But what I wanted to, what do you think is the difference between a core and a kit? When does Apple decide to call something a core, and when is it a kit, and why?
The way I think of it is that a core is like something that's underlying, something that seems very much part of the operating system. A core audio, for example, is something that just anything, any app can tap into and just have audio. It can just be connected to the system speakers or the microphones. And it means that manufacturers of audio equipment and applications don't have to bother with drivers. It's just all built in. Whereas a kit, I see as something as more of like a software, set of software tools for developers to use.
That was my understanding as well, and I was curious about it, so I asked a few different developers. The answers that I got were a bit mixed, but the long and the short of it is, I think it's maybe more something which Apple's marketing department dreams up, because although, yes, things like Core Audio and Core Video are really low-level frameworks, all of these are frameworks in one way or another. Apple calls them frameworks, they're like shared libraries that applications can use.
Maybe it depends on how they sound, because Core Web doesn't sound as good as WebKit.
But it's interesting that you say that, because there kind of is a core web, but we'll get onto that in a bit. Okay, so what we're talking about today is Safari, and as I said, the underlying technology that powers Safari is one of Apple's frameworks. It's a kit called WebKit. And I wanted to get the ball rolling, Charlie, if you could describe what WebKit is, what it does, and we'll take it from there.
WebKit, I think, is the underlying browser engine for Safari, but it's also used whenever any other application wants to use a web view. So when the Mail app, for example, renders an HTML, it uses WebKit to do that. And other apps can use it to drop in a web view without having to, write a browser engine. Also on iOS, it's the only allowed browser engine. So if you have something like Firefox or Google Chrome, on your US-based iPhone, then it will be using WebKit or as its underlying engine, and just putting its kind of fancy Google or Firefox Chrome over the top.
Exactly so, yeah. Okay, so you called it a browser engine, I think, sometimes also called a rendering engine. So what exactly does that do?
Okay, so when you open up Safari, for example, and you type in a URL, the web page comes down, but what the web page is code of various types. It used to be just HTML text,
Yeah.
and the engine would be the thing that rendered that. So it would see that you had a link to a picture, and it would instead show the picture.
Yeah. So, as you said, then web pages are coded in HTML. Then the layout is determined by CSS or cascading style sheets. And then we have JavaScript for the behavior of the page. So the browser engine is parsing that HTML code and working out from the code how it should be laid out and drawing that onto the screen. Going to look at three sections in this show. Firstly, we're going to have a quick history of web browsers and rattle through how we got to where we are now. Then we're going to look at the origins of Safari itself and how it launched, what it was for, why did Apple do this thing? And then finally, in the third chunk, we're going to look at the evolution of Safari. I thought we should start off by looking at a brief history of web browsers, because actually, in the 30-year history of the web, Safari arrived relatively early in the scene. I thought of it as a late arrival, because it was like one of the last big browsers to emerge.
Yeah, me too.
But if you think about it, it's been around for 20 years and the web's been around for 30 years. So
okay, yeah.
And the other thing which I find very interesting about Safari is it's one of the only big web browsers from that era that's still with us today.
Just Safari and Firefox, I'd say, no? Are the only major ones left.
Yeah. So, setting the scene, it's 2003. Beyonce is crazy in love. The Black Eyed Peas are wondering where is the love. And John Mayer, rather disturbingly, is telling us that our body is a wonderland.
John Mayer? Oh.
The top TV shows at the time were Friends and The Apprentice. The first Safari beta was introduced by Steve Jobs in 2003, Macworld San Francisco, and it ran on macOS 10.2 Jaguar, as we would say in the UK.
Yep.
So when Steve Jobs launched Safari, he called it the turbo browser for macOS 10. So it was very much all about speed at the time. And really for most of us, it came from left field. We were not expecting Apple to announce a browser. Although some people more in the know were kind of aware that Apple was doing something in this area because of all the hires they'd made in the previous 2 years. And I've got another interesting bit of trivia before we get into the meat of it. Charlie, do you know what Safari almost got called before it was called Safari?
I can't remember. I've definitely read it, but I've forgotten completely.
Well, I found two names that were being bandied around at the time. One of them is absolutely terrible but obvious, which is eyebrows.
Oh, God.
That's that not eyebrows as in what's above your eyes, but I with the letter I, like I am browsing, eyebrows.
They could have had Roger Moore doing ads for it.
Yes, perfect. And then the other name, which it almost got called, was Freedom. What do you make of that?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of get where they're coming from because, as I'm sure you're going to get to, one of the reasons for having Safari was so that Apple wouldn't be beholden to anybody else to make a web browser for the Mac.
Exactly.
But at the same time, it's a little bit, I don't know, imagine if it was called Freedom now with all the trouble they're having, all the antitrust problems. The headlines would write themselves. So maybe I wish they did do it just for work purposes.
I think it would have been quite a badass name, but I understand why they didn't go with it. And then there's a third name, which was its project code name, which was Alexander.
Wow.
And there's a great story about this. If you want to know about the naming of Safari, then there's a story on the blog of Don Melton, who's a former director of Internet Technologies at Apple, who tells the story of this. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes if you're interested in reading more. So now we're going to look at the 2003 launch in a bit more detail. But before we get into it, I wanted to wind the clock back just actually only 10 years to 1991 when the World Wide Web itself was created. Now, I'm guessing, Charlie, you know a little about this because it's tech legend. Who invented the web?
The web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee.
Yeah, Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, the European Particle Accelerator Organization in Switzerland. This was about accelerating particles. It wasn't about developing new internet applications, but rather randomly, Tim Berners-Lee invented the world's first web browser, which was called World Wide Web, all one word, with the capital what. And it was released to the public in 1991. This first web browser was incredibly basic. It just had text. There were no images. And a couple of years later, in 1993, CERN decided to make the underlying web protocol, which Tim Berners-Lee had invented, available royalty-free to the public. And that's what really kicked off its widespread use. So here we're talking about HTTP. Do you know what that stands for?
Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
Exactly right. Yeah. So with HTTP and the underlying technology of the web free for public use, along comes the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, or NCSA, that develops another web browser called Mosaic in 1993. The NCSA is a state-federal partnership to develop and deploy national-scale cyber infrastructure that advances research, science, and engineering based in the United States. They called the browser Mosaic because it combined HTTP, the underlying web protocol, with other protocols like FTP. And so it mixed different internet protocols together in like a mosaic. And that's how it got its name. It's a bit of trivia there. It originally ran in X Windows on Unix, but soon after came a Windows Mac and Amiga version. So you'd have been pleased about the Amiga version there, Charlie. It's a long-time Amiga user. So that was Mosaic, and we're going to circle back to Mosaic in a minute, but a much more influential web browser then came along 1 year later in 1994.
Was that Netscape Navigator?
That was indeed. So one of the original developers of Mosaic, Mark Andreessen, went on to found Netscape, and they launched their web browser Navigator in 94, and it swiftly took over from Mosaic as the most popular web browser. And it had one big breakthrough, which previous web browsers did not have. Do you know what that was? It starts with Java and ends with script.
Is it JavaScript?
It is JavaScript. Yeah, so the big breakthrough in Netscape Navigator was JavaScript. They wanted to make more dynamic web pages, and back then in 1994, web pages were very static. So you would load a web page, and then you'd load another web page. But a web page couldn't really do anything. It was literally just a page of text and images. And so they wanted something a little bit more dynamic. So they introduced this scripting language. At the time, Java was a very trendy new programming language. You could develop Java applets and stuff like this. And so they decided to call their scripting language JavaScript, just to get a bit of the sort of fairy dust magic of Java, although actually JavaScript really doesn't have anything to do with Java at all. That was more of a kind of marketing department move than a techie move. It's one of those things probably only serves to confuse. JavaScript doesn't have anything more to do with the Indonesian island than it does to do with Java, the programming language. It's just what Netscape decided to call this thing to make it sound cool. One of the early uses of JavaScript was something called AJAX. Do you know what AJAX stands for?
Asynchronous JavaScript something. I don't know what the X part is.
Oh, that's close. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML.
Ah, an XML.
So yeah, this enabled web pages to communicate directly with servers without having to reload the page. Initially, you could use it for simple things like form validation. So, just to check that all the fields in a form have been filled in correctly. But later, as JavaScript got faster and a richer programming language and browsers got more sophisticated, you could use it for building what they call web apps. So like building a whole app as a web page. Internet Explorer is obviously going to be a really important part of this story. It's an important part of how and why Safari came to be. And I promised that we would circle back to NCSA Mosaic, and that's exactly what we're going to do now, because one of the interesting things about Internet Explorer is that it was actually based upon a commercial version of the Mosaic web browser that was developed by a company called Spyglass Inc. Internet Explorer launched in 1995. It became a hit when it eventually was bundled free with Windows, and that basically killed Netscape. Because we're talking about the mid-90s, Windows had become so dominant. Every PC already has Internet Explorer, and so there was no reason for anyone to use anything else. Everyone just used this one web browser. And the biggest problem with that was it wasn't even, as we will see, a very good web browser. At its height, in the early aughts, Internet Explorer had 95% browser market share. And it reigned for many years. It reigned up until quite recently when Microsoft retired it in favor of the Edge browser. And we're going to come back and look at exactly what that was and its connection to Safari as well. But one of the things to say about Internet Explorer was it did come along for the Mac as well, which was a bit of a lifeline for Apple at the time. They needed a web browser and everyone was using Internet Explorer. So it was helpful in the late 90s, and Steve Jobs has just returned to Apple. It was helpful for Steve Jobs to be able to say, look, we have IE as well. So it doesn't matter whether you have a Mac or a PC, You've got IE.
That wasn't quite true, though, was it?
No, tell me about that.
Well, even though it was Internet Explorer, the Mac version just didn't always open pages properly. It wouldn't display pages, which will work fine on the PC version.
Yeah, Internet Explorer was on the Windows PC and on the Mac. And so you would think then, oh, it's the same experience on both, but it wasn't. And one of the reasons why it wasn't the same was actually kind of ironic that the Mac version, in some respects, was a little bit better than the PC version, but that was a problem because it meant it wasn't the same as the PC version. Coming back to when we were talking about browser engines, HTML, the code that you code web pages with, it handles the semantics. It tells you what's a headline, what's a paragraph, what's a table, and stuff like that. But it doesn't tell you what they should look like, or it doesn't tell you where exactly they should go on the page. And that is handled by something called cascading style sheets, or CSS. This was a language that was developed by Netscape at the same time that they came up with JavaScript in the early 90s, and it was ratified as a web standard. So HTML doesn't, or it shouldn't tell you like what color something is or what font something is. All of that sort of formatting information is handled by CSS. In the late 90s, Internet Explorer for Mac was one of the best implementations of CSS of any browser on the market. It was one of the most standards compliant. And so it was one of the first browsers, or the first browser, to achieve 100% support for the CSS spec. When you might think, well, that sounds great. But the problem was that Microsoft on Internet Explorer for Windows had done its own thing. CSS on Windows was completely incompatible with the standard. So because Microsoft hadn't followed the standard on their browser for their own platform, which had 95% market share, but they had on Internet Explorer for Mac, that meant that all the web developers were developing for Internet Explorer for Windows. So they were using CSS in Microsoft's non-standard way. One of the most important issues was to do with the box model. So you could define how much padding there was in a box and how much margin there was around a box, which meant that the margins in the boxes all looked messed up on Internet Explorer for Mac. Now you could, as a web developer, sniff the user agent, identify if it was a standards compliant browser like Internet Explorer for Mac, or a quirky web browser like Internet Explorer for Windows, and do two different style sheets. But were you really going to bother when you could just do a non-standard based one for Internet Explorer for Windows, and you've covered 95% of the market, and a few Mac users are going to just get a shitty experience, and tough luck to them. So that was a situation we found ourselves in the 1990s. Microsoft did not embrace standards at this point. They wanted to do things their own way. And a lot of the things that Apple is doing today with its app platform, Microsoft wanted to do back in the early aughts with Windows. They wanted to dominate. They were working on a platform called Trusted Computing, called Palladium. It was a strategy that would very much lock out non-Microsoft technology from computing. So they weren't satisfied with 95% market share. They wanted everything.
That sounds familiar. Apple not satisfied with being the richest company in the world. They want more.
A couple of other browsers that I'm going to mention because they are going to be important to us in a sec. One is Conqueror. Do you know anything about Conqueror?
No, apart from that it exists and I've heard of it, but I don't remember it.
So this was the web browser that was distributed with KDE, a Linux desktop. It was initially released in 2000, and it had its own web rendering engine, KHTML, which was kind of ahead of the competition. And two more important browsers to have in mind, Camino. Do you remember Camino? I'd imagine that you would be a Camino fan.
Yeah, wasn't Camino like a Mac-type Netscape navigator?
The main developer behind Camino was a guy called Dave Hyatt, and he's going to be a really important part of the Safari story. Another web browser that Dave Hyatt developed whilst he was at Mozilla, and he was one of the co-creators of. And you've already mentioned this web browser before, Charlie.
Is that Firefox?
It is indeed Firefox, and one of the few browsers still standing from that era. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, and the company was on the edge of bankruptcy, Jobs did a deal with Bill Gates that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and guarantee the development of Office for Mac for 5 years. That's a deal we've spoken about on this show before. Well, one of the important aspects of this deal was not only did Apple agree to drop its long-running lawsuit against Microsoft for stealing elements of macOS, but Apple also agreed to bundle Internet Explorer with the Mac as its default web browser. Prior to this deal, Netscape was the default web browser of the Mac. So this was obviously something on Bill Gates' shopping list. He wanted global domination with Internet Explorer. And so he got this 5-year deal. So that was 1997. So the 5-year deal expired in 2002. January 2003, Steve Jobs is launching his own web browser. So I only realized that when I was looking at the dates, but that
Wow.
cannot be an accident, can it?
No, not at all.
This is a pattern, I think, when you look at all the moves Steve Jobs makes, he's always making pragmatic short-term moves, and he's making these much more strategic long-term plays.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect, even as he was saying, sure, Bill, I'll put Internet Explorer on the Mac in 1997, he was thinking, this deal is 5 years, and by the time it expires, I'm going to be ready to hit the ground running with my own browser. He would have understood that just in the way that Internet Explorer had become so important to Microsoft, Safari was going to be very, very important to the Mac, and as it turned out, to almost every other product that Apple has since shipped. So 2002, the deal with Microsoft expired, and then in January 2003 at Macworld San Francisco, the first beta of Safari was announced. And Charlie, I'm going to send something for you to read.
We've done our own browser, and it's hot. It's the first major new browser in 5 years. It's sweet.
That was Steve Jobs, and that's how Jobs announced Safari. It's sweet. And he wasn't wrong. Steve Jobs then asked a rhetorical question. He said, why did we do a browser? And he gave 2 reasons. One was speed, and the other was innovation. On the speed side, Safari was 3 times faster than Internet Explorer for Mac. Should qualify that obviously Internet Explorer on Windows was a lot faster. But I guess, Microsoft was quite relaxed with allowing Apple users to get a subpar web experience.
Yeah.
On the innovation side, Steve Jobs said it was the best browser ever. And there were a few features that Jobs highlighted of the original Safari to justify this claim. One of them was the integration of Google in the toolbar. And this was the first browser to integrate Google in this way, an arrangement which proved to be very lucrative to Apple.
Problematic.
Not at all problematic, but made them a fortune. Do you remember Snapback?
Oh, yeah. Snapback was a little... Was it an orange arrow that would appear in the URL field on the left side? And so you would type in a URL, and then you go browsing, and then you would go to lots of different pages. And if you hit Snapback, it would take you back to the original URL that you typed in. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. I never really used that. Did you ever use Snapback?
Well, I wouldn't say it's enough to make it the best browser ever. It was handy. I mean, I did use it from time to time. It wasn't something that I never used, but it was not really when it went away, I didn't really miss it.
Yeah, same. The whole app looked like this is an app brought to you from the people that created iTunes. iTunes and iPod were so huge around 2003. And so Apple was trying to leverage the popularity of this product to everything else. And so that's why they wanted to make Safari look like iTunes, which it did. And Steve Jobs actually said in the keynote, look, the bookmarks look like iTunes.
I think it looks super cool. I loved it when it came. I liked iTunes. I mean, Brush Metal didn't age well, but when it first came out, it looked so cool. It didn't feel like other computer things, which are, all very dull and blue and grey, like Windows. It looked modern and neat.
Well, yeah. One of the things I found really interesting, watching Steve Jobs' original demo for Safari in 2003, is a huge amount of the way in which Safari works on the Mac today is identical to how it worked back then. If you use the favorites bar, for example, which I love, that's exactly the same as it always was. If you click the plus button, add something to your favorite bar, rename it, drag things around in the favorite bar, drag them off, drag them into the bookmarks, all of that stuff that was designed in 2003 is exactly the same today.
The bookmark bar is great. I use that all the time. And what I really like about Safari's implementation of that, because obviously other browsers do something similar now, is that you can use the command keys to open those bookmarks. So command 1 opens the first one and across the top. And it's super handy if you have bookmarklets up there, because you can launch them. For instance, I have one that I use DuckDuckGo as my search engine. And if I want something from Reddit, I hit command 1 and it uses a bookmarklet to flip to Google search. Plus, I've got others. I've got one that clips it to Trello. I've got another one that puts a YouTube video into full screen, a bunch of things like that. So I don't actually have any bookmarks up there. I think they're all little bookmark lists that do things. And it means that I can do them all just with a keyboard shortcut, command plus a number.
I might have known that you had a special way of using the bookmark bar on Safari.
Yeah, of course.
Steve Jobs described this initial beta of Safari that they launched in 2003 as a very, very solid beta release. But it did have a bug button in the top right-hand corner. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I do remember that, yeah.
And it was literally a little bug on a button, and Steve Jobs explained why. I am going to send you, Charlie, another little quote.
There are over 10 million websites out there, and I'm sorry to report that we haven't had time to test Safari with each one. So what we've done is if you encounter a website that has any problems, we've got this button that you can push and tell us what the problem is.
And I love this because when Steve Jobs said that, he meant 10 million to be a huge number, right?
Yeah.
Which it was at the time, but to me, the idea of 10 million websites sounds like an almost manageable number. Like, maybe you could almost test Safari on all of them.
Well, I suppose technically, though, there still are over 10 million websites.
Well, that's true, yeah. One of the things that I was very fond about with Safari was that it had native controls. And by this, I mean, macOS 10 had a very distinctive look and feel, right? The buttons and drop-down menus, and they were all shiny, translucent, glossy user interface elements. But those user interface elements didn't appear on Netscape or Internet Explorer. They all had their own cross-platform user interface elements, so buttons were dull grey. They didn't look like macOS 10 buttons. And so I didn't like that. With Safari, web pages looked like proper macOS 10 user interfaces. If you had a form on a web page and you looked at it in Safari, then all the controls like the drop-down menus and buttons and so forth, they all look just the way in which Steve Jobs intended. And so that was something I was very fond of.
Yeah, I'm looking at now an old image of Safari. It looked so much easier to use than Safari now. The Chrome is heavier. Definitely, there's more of it. But for instance, on the edge of a tab, you've got the 3 diagonal lines that show you like a little grip, like as if so to show you can grab it and move it. And, it makes it more obvious what's happening.
It has become progressively more minimalist, hasn't it?
Yeah, to its detriment, I think.
The way that browsers prior to Safari had handled the progress bar type thing of showing when a web page was loaded, do you remember how they did that?
Did they have a spinny circle? Was it a circle?
It was an animated logo in the top right-hand corner.
Oh, yeah, of course. And so it didn't really show you any progress, just that it was loading.
Yes, exactly. That it was doing something, yeah, and it hadn't finished. But this was like really tacky. It actually was started by Mosaic that had like an M, and the M animated in this square in the top right-hand corner of the web browser as the page was loading. And that there was copied by Netscape, who put an N, and that it was so gaudy, the animated N for the Netscape web browser. I think it had like stars and fireworks and moons and suns and all kinds of things moving around the N. It was too much. It was not demure. It was not mindful.
So yeah, Apple would never do anything like that. For instance, it would never make it so that when you're on a FaceTime call to your doctor or your psychologist, if you did a thumbs up, that it would generate inappropriate animation on the screen.
It was very classy that Apple got rid of that, and no web browser has an animated logo today. I suppose the last one was probably Internet Explorer, which had their animated E.
Mm-hmm.
Last observation on that original version of Safari, something that design-wise I really liked, was it had a non-standard default style sheet. What this is if a web browser is going to render a web page and there is no CSS, then it needs to decide what fonts to use and what sizes to use and what color to use and so forth. So it has a default style sheet that it uses. And always historically, the typeface used had been Times New Roman. And it's such an ugly typeface. No one uses this typeface for anything else.
It's hideous. I really don't like it.
So Apple changed the default font in their default style sheet to Myriad, which was their corporate font at the time. Basically, the default style sheet was the Mac user interface. But that caused problems. I think lots of people ended up hitting the bug button because of this. Because, of course, web developers a lot of them are not very good, and they were relying on the default star sheet being Times New Roman for one reason or another. So if you change the default star sheet from what all the other browsers have, it broke a whole bunch of things.
I bet whenever Steve Jobs saw a bug report said that it should have looked like Times New Roman, he probably hit the roof.
I think so. To me, it's the things that I love about Apple, that they challenge everything that is not aesthetic. And Times New Roman was not aesthetic. They challenged it, but in the end, it was critical that when people used Safari, things looked the way that they expected them to look. And so ultimately, they switched the star sheet to look much more like all the other browsers. Right, Charlie, I'm going to send you something else to read. This is another quote from Steve Jobs during the Safari launch, and this came as a shock at the time. When Steve Jobs said this on stage, someone interrupted and shouted, "What the fuck?" So just imagine that Charlie is Steve Jobs and that people in the audience are shocked, and someone even shouts, "What the fuck?" Imagine a sharp indrawing of breath. I'm sending it to you now.
Okay. I remember this. Safari is based on standards. It's a very modern technology. We base Safari on an HTML rendering engine that is open source. About half the code in Safari is this open source rendering engine. Now, we started working with this open source code base over a year ago, and it needed a lot of work. Now, it's dramatically faster. Some people have a problem with open source. We think it's great. And we're going to be putting all of our improvements into this code base. We're going to be posting them on the web today. Was that where they said, "What the fuck"?
No, it's actually, it's this next bit. I'm going to shout it just as you say it.
Okay, the code base that we decided to start with is KHTML.
What the fuck?
It's very popular in the Linux world, and it's a very well-architected HTML rendering engine that is now dramatically improved, and we have built an incredible browser around it.
So why were people so shocked? Well, I'm going to say people. This is a very narrow audience of web browser developers who were shocked by this, because everyone had been assuming that Safari was going to be based on Mozilla's Gecko web browser engine. People in the web development community knew that Apple had hired Dave Hyatt away from Mozilla. He had co-created Firefox and he'd developed the Camino web browser, which was based on Gecko. He was a Gecko expert. And so, and Gecko was really good. You know, there was no question that this was a next generation browser engine, as evidenced by the fact that it is, as you said, still around today, and Firefox is still around. It was good.
Yeah.
And everyone assumed that this is what Apple was going to use, but they didn't. They used KHTML. So what KHTML was, just kind of rewinding, this is why I mentioned Conqueror a little earlier, a web browser almost no one's heard of today, KDE, a Linux desktop. And KDE had developed this new rendering engine for Conqueror called KHTML. And this is the open source project that Steve Jobs is referring to, which they based Safari on. So it was not a mainstream or obvious choice at all. And it was a controversial choice at the time. But I think, given what has happened with WebKit since, this is the technology on which pretty much every web browser is based today, with a few notable exceptions. But if you're using Edge, if you're using Chrome, if you're using Safari, if you're using many other web browsers embedded into all kinds of products, they're all based upon some variant of KHTML. And Apple was really the first big organization to swoop in and see something of value in KHTML and develop their own rendering engine based on it.
Just an aside, did you know that Conqueror is still going? On my old MacBook Air that I put Linux on, I used the KDE desktop environment for that. And I use Firefox as the browser, but Conqueror is still available. The last release was 4 days ago. So it's still being actively supported. It's web browsing using KHTML or KDE WebKit as rendering engines. So I guess they're still, because it's open source, so they can, no?
Well, that's true. And on that, I thought at this point it was worth unpacking what exactly open source is, because it's going to play a really important part in the next chapter of the Safari story. So, Charlie, how would you describe open source?
Open source is when the source code used to write the software is open. Anyone can see it and read it. Anyone can take it and compile it, depending on the license. They can use it in their own software. They can contribute any changes they make back to the original, and they may be folded in, or they can fork it into something completely different and go off in a new direction. But the important part is, which I'm guessing you're going to get to, is that if you use open source software in your own project, then the license continues. Anything you build on it also remains open source. Again, depending on the license, there are some open source licenses that are more or less permissive, but that's the general idea.
Exactly right. Yeah. So, I mean, what you're referring to there is copyleft licenses, where if you make changes or improvements to code which is distributed under an open source copyleft license, then any improvements you make, you have to share with everyone else as well.
Yeah, similar to Creative Commons so if I take a photograph and share it with a Creative Commons share alike license, for example, it means that you can use it for whatever you want, but if you then publish that, then your creation is also covered under the license. That it also becomes a share alike.
Exactly right. And this is one of the important things, because in the case of Apple's operating systems, the open source component is called Darwin. You could install Darwin on a PC, but it doesn't give you all the nice, glossy, lickable UI or any of those bits. It gives you the Unix underpinnings of Apple's OS, but it doesn't give you the proprietary secret sauce that they build on top of that. And likewise, when we think about Safari is built on open source technology, and they've built a proprietary layer on top of that. So some aspects of Safari are open source and have to be distributed free, but other aspects of Safari are proprietary. So if you want the whole of Safari, Apple can distribute that, and as they see fit, they can charge for it or not. They can make it only available on certain platforms. That's up to Apple. But there are some open source projects that they've used, like KHTML, and any parts of KHTML that they've used, they then have to distribute under the same license. And then coming back to copyleft, in the case of KHTML, it's distributed under an LGPL license, and that's a copyleft license. So anything which is distributed under LGPL, improvements you make to it, just as you were saying with Creative Commons, Charlie, any improvements you make have to be shared as well. So one of the funny things that Steve Jobs was saying, that a huge slide appears behind him as he's presenting this, that says, open source, we think it's great. And he says, unlike other people, we think open source is great. And he's making a distinction here with Microsoft, I guess, because Microsoft at the time was famously anti-open source software. Ironically, if you look at it today, the two companies have really switched around, that Apple's much more proprietary software now, and Microsoft has actually embraced all kinds of open source software. So the roles are kind of reversed. But back in 2003, Steve Jobs was claiming that Apple loved open source software. I think the truth, even back in 2003, was rather different. I think Apple and Steve Jobs did love open source software, but only in the way in which you love chocolate. You guzzle as much chocolate as you can because you love it. Not like the way in which you love your family, in which you might nurture them and, kind of appreciate them for what they are and their values. Steve Jobs liked open source because he got lots of nice free stuff. I don't think that he was ever serious about the underlying philosophy of open source software. He wasn't interested so much in the free speech side of things. And why? Why would I say that? Why am I being mean to Steve Jobs, who I absolutely admire and love to bits? Why do I think he was being disingenuous here? Well, you only need to look at what Apple did with this code that they took. So, he said that they were going to publish on the web that same day all the improvements that they made to KHTML. And that sounds like an incredibly generous thing that Apple was doing. But because it was an LGPL license, they had to. There was no option for them but to distribute the improvements they've made. They had to. That was the terms of the license that they were using. And on top of that, what they gave back in 2003 was the absolute bare minimum. I thought, and my recollection was, that they gave back WebKit. No, they didn't give back WebKit. They gave back two specific components of WebKit that were called Web Core and JavaScript Core. So if you remember the cores, we were talking about cores and you mentioned Web Core, there is a Web Core and it's a component part of WebKit. And JavaScript Core is the JavaScript engine of the original WebKit. And those bits were based upon KHTML. So they were distributed under an LGPL license. So Apple was under obligation to distribute those back under that same LGPL license, which they did. And they shared nothing else. So the rest of WebKit remains proprietary to Apple. And not only that, but the way in which they dumped web core and JavaScript core on open source developers was particularly unhelpful because it was all mixed in with their platform specific code in a way in which you wouldn't do if you were serious about an open source project. You would give back to the community in a way that they can use.
This isn't the only time Apple has not been serious about open source technology. I think it was it with FaceTime when Steve Jobs announced FaceTime, and he said that they were going to open source it.
Yeah, he did.
And the engineers sitting in the front row all like, well, if they'd been drinking something, they would have choked on their beverages.
Because it was the first they'd heard of it, right?
Yeah, they knew nothing about it. And then, of course, they didn't actually do it anyway.
I think it wasn't technically possible. That was one of the reasons why the developers choked on their beverages, because you've got like this public key, private key encryption thing. It was non-obvious that this could ever be done. And yeah, Steve Jobs just announced it without checking with any of the developers. Yeah.
Why not?
So yeah, interesting that is why I do not believe that Steve Jobs was particularly serious about open source software. If he had been, then they would have contributed to KHTML in a much more constructive manner. One of the other interesting tidbits on that was when I was reading Don Melton's blog, he was like, some people describe him as the father of Safari, if you will. He explains how his team had to work secretly on the KHTML code for over a year. I mean, right there, that's not something you really want from an open source perspective. It would have been much more constructive if Apple had been in contact with KHTML the whole time and collaborated with them on the project, but they didn't. For obvious Apple reasons, they did it all in secret. Apparently, Don Melton was sitting in the audience of Macworld San Francisco in 2003, and the moment Steve Jobs had finished that section of the presentation where the letters KHTML appeared on screen, it was only then that Don Melton was allowed to phone up the guys at KHTML and say, "Oh, hi, I'm Don Melton, I'm at Apple, and we're going to send you some stuff later today." And that was the first that KHTML had heard of it. And I imagine that the team on KHTML had assumed that Apple would be using Gecko as well. So I think that maybe it was one of them that shouted, "Oh, fuck." So I don't know if you think about that. It's kind of like, okay, Apple back then in 2003 wasn't the juggernaut we know today, but it still was a very, very big company. Imagine if you suddenly get that call from Don Melton and you've got this relatively small project. And it's like, "Oh, we've actually been working on your code base for a year. We've made it loads better. Here you are. You're welcome." And then just dump millions of lines of code. And you didn't even know it was coming. So for all of those reasons, I don't think that Apple's commitment to open source was ever particularly ideological, but they clearly did show excellent judgment and taste in software by choosing KHTML. By everything that's come since, I think you can clearly see that they made the right choice. The one thing that I would say in Apple's defense in this era was they did make a genuine effort in the early years of Safari to engage with developers. So Dave Hyatt was allowed to maintain a blog that was cutely called Surfin' Safari. Dave Hyatt would post very regularly on this blog, and he would share with the web development community where Apple saw the browser going and what they were going to do, what they were going to implement now, what they were working on, what was coming next. And that lasted for quite a while and was very useful to developers to get that visibility on what the WebKit team was working on. It was a brief period of glasnost before the gates closed again. So moving on to the evolution of Safari. Safari's moved on to several other platforms over the years, but there's one platform to me that is more surprising than all the other platforms that Safari moved on to. And what would that be, Charlie?
That would be the iPhone.
No, even more surprising to me. Like a hell freezing over moment.
Oh, okay, Safari on Windows.
2008 was the year. At the WWDC in 2008, a year after the iPhone launched, Steve Jobs showed a pie chart where Safari at this point had less than 5% market share. And Steve Jobs said, "Oh, we want to get it to this." And he showed another pie chart. This showed a 1/3 market share. And he was saying, we'd really like to get Safari to 1/3 market share. And I am going to send you, Charlie, another quote that I have here from Steve Jobs.
"Mac's market share is growing, and this is great. But we want to grow maybe in addition to that. And to do that, we're going to have to create a version of Safari that runs on Windows. We have a little bit of expertise in that because of iTunes. And that is exactly what we've done."
So this is a little bit of a word salad from Steve Jobs here. One of the things I find really funny about it is there's a tacit admission here that the Mac is never going to really grow very big. But he didn't want to say that. So he starts by saying, the Mac market share is growing and that's great. And it's like, and in addition to that, we want Safari to get even bigger than that. So that's why Windows. And then why is he mentioning iTunes? I think one of the questions here that he anticipated an objection to Apple doing Safari for Windows was, how are you going to distribute Windows software? You guys know nothing about Windows. You're not Windows developers. And so he was saying, well, actually, we are Windows developers because we develop iTunes and it's like one of the biggest apps on Windows, which was sort of true at the time.
Maybe Apple had a bit of a weird idea of why people were downloading iTunes. I don't think it was because it was a superior music player. But if you had an iPod or later an iPhone, you had to have iTunes in order to use it with your Windows PC. Whereas they already had a browser. And also switching to a new browser for no good reason, one that isn't as compatible with the web as the one you already use. So it's essentially a worse browser from most people's point of view is a major hassle. I wonder why they did it. I mean, trying to grow the market share of the browser, I guess makes sense. I mean, maybe that was it. But it's because it doesn't seem like there's any other good reason for putting, apart from, I guess, they have their, the halo effect. If people use Safari, they might start thinking, oh, maybe I should buy a Mac.
The justification Steve Jobs used for why someone would use Safari on Windows when they already had Internet Explorer was performance. On screen, he showed an iBench test comparing IE with Firefox and Safari, and he claimed that Safari was over twice as fast as IE and 1.6 times as fast as Firefox. Think really believed in Safari and they really believed in WebKit. It was a better web browser and they thought the hegemony of IE is bad for the Mac because it means instead of people developing for web standards, they develop for IE. Mm-hmm. And so we need to reduce Internet Explorer's market share to force web developers to develop for standards rather than develop for Windows. And I think they thought we have the best browser and we should leverage that to really champion web standards. But we can only do that if we're on the biggest OS. I think that was the rationale. And maybe it would have worked if it wasn't for the fact that something else happened that year as well, which was from Google, a certain web browser.
Ah, that was Chrome.
Chrome came out the same year. And this was obviously going to be a spanner in the works. And I remember at the time thinking, Apple is going to lose this. And the reason that I thought that they were going to lose it was because Google spent a fortune on marketing. I remember all over London, I was standing on the platform of London Underground, and there were all these poster ads for Google Chrome everywhere. Google did this huge push, TV, outdoor, press. They invested massively in this, whereas I think Apple didn't spend a penny on advertising Safari. And, this is where the open source part of the story is important as well, because how did Google suddenly come up with a brilliant browser from nowhere? Well, at this point, Apple had actually made the whole of WebKit open source, and Google just thought, great, thanks, we'll have that. And they built their own web browser, Chrome, on top of WebKit.
I bet Steve Jobs was very, very happy about that.
Initially, Google played nice with Apple and contributed to the WebKit project. But very soon, they basically did to Apple exactly what Apple had done to KDE and decided, right, fine, we'll have this. And they branched WebKit, created their own browser engine called Blink, and the rest is history. But that is why I think it's really interesting that KDE became Safari, Safari became Chrome, Chrome became Brave. Every browser today pretty much can trace its lineage back to KHTML and WebKit. One of the other big differentiators, I think it wasn't just Google's marketing push. They also had developed their own JavaScript engine called V8 that was much, much faster than Apple's JavaScript at the time. Although the two companies then started to really vie with each other for the fastest JavaScript. And this had become super important because this was the time when web applications were becoming really big. And so JavaScript performance was a real bottleneck and had become key. Google was investing a fortune on this and doing really great work. They had by far the best JavaScript engine at the time. So there were technical reasons to choose Chrome over Safari as well.
And Google was really, well, I mean, they had an interest in having fast JavaScript because of all of their web apps. No, I mean everything from Gmail and through G Suite. So all that stuff is, very heavy on the JavaScript. This is really when the web browser as an operating system really started to be a thing. It's an operating system contained within the browser.
That could have been it for Safari. It could have been at this point Chrome came along and drank Safari's milkshake. But it didn't quite go down that way because obviously 2007, the year prior, the iPhone had come out.
Yes, the iPhone, exactly. I think that Safari on the iPhone is probably the most important incarnation of Safari.
Yeah. And why is that?
Well, because it was, as Steve Jobs liked to say, the first real browser on a phone. We had browsers, but they either used a subset of the regular web technologies. What was the name of the WAP, Wireless Access Protocol?
It means something very different now.
Does it? Is it something bad?
Something very rude, yes.
Okay.
If you believe Cardi B.
Okay, I'm going to look it up. Yeah, so there was the WAP browsers, and you'd have various browsers, but they would not be able to do everything. Whereas Safari, more or less, once you got a page to load on over its edge network, it meant that you had it was a real web browser, and it would show the actual web page that you were expecting to see. Because of course there was no mobile web then, so a web page that was made for a big desktop computer screen or a laptop screen wasn't going to work very well on a little phone screen. So they had ways of collapsing that. And you could do tricks like being able to double tap on a picture or a paragraph and have it zoom to perfectly fit the page so you could read it. Tricks like that, which are so nice. And when you don't have that and you have to manually pinch and zoom, it's quite annoying. And then, without getting ahead of ourselves, it actually changed the way the internet worked because Apple refused to use Flash.
You perfectly segued us to the next bit. So, this is one of the bones of contention was at that time in 2007, 2008, Flash from Adobe was a very dominant technology. And it's a bit strange to think about today because anything that back then you did with Flash, you could do today with web standards. But browsers were a little bit less sophisticated then, and now you can do all the stuff that Flash could do. You can do in the browser with web standards. But Flash was a plugin that extended what web browsers could do to do all kinds of animation and stuff like that. In fact, you could build whole apps with Flash, and they would be cross-platform. So there was a Flash plugin for the Mac, and there was a Flash plugin for Windows. And so Adobe Flash developers could build an app in Flash and have it run on Windows and Macs in the web browser. That was good for Adobe, but it wasn't necessarily good for anyone else. It wasn't good for anyone else, I would say, because it was a bit crap. Kevin Lynch, who was working at Adobe at the time, and he was the boss of Flash, he moved over to Apple.
He's the Apple Watch guy now, no?
And I think he's now bigger than that. I think he worked on Apple Car as well.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, for years he was the head of Apple Watch.
I like him because he looks like a real nerd who never goes out.
In my mind, I can't help having negative associations with him because I always associate him with Adobe Flash. So for a whole bunch of reasons, Apple refused to develop Flash for the iPhone or for Safari. And people wanted it because it meant that if you went to a website that used the Flash plugin, it didn't work. So there was lots of fuss in the media, people saying, Apple needs to do this. And famously, Google was saying, we're going to support Flash native in Android, which actually never happened. But, this was one where Apple got a lot of criticism. And one of the things I find fascinating, going back and looking at this now, is lots of the discourse back then feels very current and relevant to what's going on today. So Steve Jobs wrote an open letter called Thoughts on Flash, and it was a devastating critique of Flash, where he basically eviscerated Flash. And I don't know, after this, maybe Kevin Lynch lost his job and I had to go and work for Apple instead. It's a fairly long letter, so I've just picked out a couple of bits that I think are most interesting for our purposes that I was going to send to you, Charlie, so you could read.
This is one of the things I miss most about Steve Jobs' era at Apple, is that he would just stick out on the front page of, apple.com, a blog post, essentially, and it would usually be calling somebody out for something, Thoughts on Flash, or the one he did about DRM in music and iTunes.
I'd forgotten that, but yeah, I think you're right. They did put it on the front page. Amazing.
Mm-hmm. Adobe has characterized our decision as being primarily business driven. They say we want to protect our app store, but in reality, it's based on technology issues. Adobe claims that we're a closed system and that Flash is open, but in fact, the opposite is true. Oh, the irony.
Yeah, it really has got vibes of today as well, right?
We know from painful experience that letting a third-party layer of software come between the platform and the developer ultimately results in substandard apps and hinders the enhancement and progress of the platform. If developers grow dependent on third-party development libraries and tools, They can only take advantage of platform enhancements if and when the third party chooses to adopt the new features. We cannot be at the mercy of a third party deciding if and when they will make our enhancements available to our developers. This seems like a very important part of it for Apple, because one of the things that they do, especially on iOS, is to push new technologies every year with the updates, and they really push them. And they promote apps that use those new features. And very important for them is the speed of the uptake of the operating system update. They always boast about how many users, or what percentage of users is now on the latest version of iOS. Whereas having somebody else in control of that, like core things of what the browser can do and what can be done on their computer, it doesn't seem that they'd be very happy with that at all. But yeah, this is interesting, because Apple's in a similar situation now, kind of, where instead of Flash, it's just the entire web is the platform. Even like Dropbox as a cross-platform, then things built on Electron, like Slack and all the other bits and pieces, which don't really fit into the native Mac platform. And a lot of the time, I use Obsidian, which is it does everything really, but I use it for text and for documents. And when I'm editing text in that, it almost works like a native Mac text editor, but some of the keyboard shortcuts don't do exactly what you'd expect. And it's always frustrating, because those things are so automatic in your fingers. And it's, from the point of view of the user, it's great because you can switch platforms. It's the opposite of what Apple was doing with, and Google also, with things like their passkey implementation, or any other kinds of lock-in. Apple's got plenty of lock-in in its system, like with the App Store and everything like this. So having cross-platform things is not very good for them. But on the other, it's also not great for users, because you're not getting the advantages of using the Mac platform, because you're not having all the nice built-in keyboard shortcuts and other technology. All the kits and the cores aren't being used.
Exactly right. Back in the day, with this battle between Apple and Adobe, Apple won, and they saw off Flash. They never implemented it on the iPhone. And then Google backed down and didn't implement it in Android, and Flash died. It doesn't exist anymore. And I would say that Steve Jobs, with his thoughts on Flash, killed it and championed web standards and web standard browsers like Safari. And I think it's interesting that now, ironically, we're in the opposite situation, because Apple is now not championing web standards, they're championing their own proprietary platform. But oddly, my instinct is that Steve Jobs, if he was alive today, would probably be fully behind that. Because as I said, I'm not sure that his support for open web standards was anything more than a marriage of convenience. It suited Apple at the time because they were the underdog. But then once they become as big as Apple are today, then they don't need to worry so much about standards. I don't know. What do you think about that?
For Apple, I think their platform is, obviously it's macOS and iOS, but really the thing I think for them is the App Store. And these platforms are a way of making for them service revenues, which is their biggest growing, source of income now. And I think that in some ways, I wonder, because in the App Store, it's possible to write apps with cross-platform tools as well. It's not just on the Mac where you can run deploy Electron things, which is basically just a web browser as an app.
Yeah.
But you can use cross-platform development tools to pop out apps for Android as well as iOS. And
that's a battle that Apple lost in the end with stuff like React Native as well. Now they tried to stop those cross-platform tools from being used on the App Store, but in the end they gave in.
It's a complicated situation, because obviously Apple wants to be in command of everything and wants to be able to come up with new technologies and features that set it apart from the competition. And for that to happen, everybody needs to be using the latest versions of its platforms. But on the other hand, it makes money either way. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, obviously Steve Jobs was trying to make the best products he knew how. That's what he always said, and he was doing that because he wanted the company to make money. But I think the motivator for Steve Jobs was to make the best products that he knew how. And if you look at the arguments that he's making with thoughts on Flash and what he's trying to do with Safari, although I think he was a little bit disingenuous in his love of open source, I do believe that he always loved making great products. His interest in open source was it enabled him to make better products. I think that is why he liked it.
I guess he probably didn't have a problem with open source, because it's, in a way, it's very much in the spirit of like early Apple. just building things based on, taking things and building other things on top of them. But I agree. I think for him, the money was a way of not being like, it was important for Apple to make as much money as possible. So it wasn't ever again in a situation that it was in before he came back and, made the iMac and saved the day. But I think that was it. And that was not to say that it wasn't a corporate entity or anything like this, but I really don't think it was I don't think the priority was making money for the sake of making money. And I think now it is. And I think that is, and Jobs, even though it was a public company, he was happy to do whatever he wanted despite the shareholder. But as soon as Jobs went, that was not the case anymore. And, you've got Tim Cook in charge and his priorities are obviously very different.
In that sense, thoughts on Flash. Steve Jobs was thinking about what is the best way to make Safari? Mm-hmm. What's the best way to make an iPhone? What is the best way to use these technologies? And I think that's why it's actually so powerful and why he won, was that he was championing good technology. I know every developer that I knew at the time, they agreed with Steve Jobs' thoughts on Flash. He was giving a voice to a concern that a lot of people in the tech industry had about Flash and about where web standards and the web needed to go. And he gave them a voice and used his charisma and influence to steer the web in a very positive direction. So obviously we don't know if Steve was around today what his position on stuff like the App Store would be. But I think when you look at something like Thoughts on Flash, the Apple today lacks that credible, charismatic, convincing voice that Steve Jobs gave the company. When he spoke, people listened and they really thought about the points that he made. Plus, he had just had a way of articulating this stuff that got people thinking and cut through a lot of noise, because there was a great deal of noise about Flash at the time, and he just cut through it, and it was a killer blow. One last thing to say on this about the App Store and its relationship to Safari. I don't know if you remember, but in 2007, when the iPhone came out, there wasn't an App Store. And Steve Jobs at the time was not convinced that there ever should be an App Store. And what they said when people were asking, well, what if we want to develop our own apps for iPhone? Steve Jobs said, well, you can develop web apps. Steve Jobs was resistant to the App Store. So when he's talking about the web for developing web apps, I think he was serious about that, but it wasn't really... I mean, now you can build web apps that are almost as good as native apps, but that wasn't really the case in 2007 when the original iPhone came out. So that's your episode for today. What did you make of it, Charlie? What have we learned?
This is a really good illustration of how Apple likes to control every part from top to bottom. Wanting to build a browser comes from the same drive as wanting to have Apple Silicon instead of using Intel chips. It's about controlling everything. But also, it's a neat history of how important the browser's been. I mean, the browser is everything. I think it's a very interesting history of that, but also how the browser has weakened Apple's platform somewhat as well because of this, because so many things now are on the internet and the web, especially like businessy things and productivity apps. They just work in the browser. And so you're picking the Mac almost because you like the hardware more. And also, do you use Safari?
I do, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I used it from the moment it came out. Really, really liked it. But recently, because I started using Firefox on Linux, I realized that Firefox is actually quite nice. The main thing is it's way faster. Pages load a lot faster in Firefox than they do in Safari.
I use Safari obviously because it's the Apple one, and I'm very much still an Apple fan. But also, whenever I look at those other browsers, I just think they look really ugly.
I agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
Chrome has always been an oddball. The way that the tabs and stuff work is just bizarre, and I find it very aesthetically displeasing, and I just don't want to look at it. Safari looks nicer, and that's important to me as an app that I'm going to be using all the time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
There's a lot of nostalgia for me with Safari as well. So Safari represents a golden era of Apple, and I think every time I launch that Compass app, it gives me this warm feeling. It's kind of associated with like the best computing time in my life. They were firing on all cylinders when this came out. It was really a golden age for Steve Jobs at Apple. Well, that's your episode, and thanks to everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you're feeling generous, please give us a star rating in the Apple Podcast app and maybe even a review. It really helps with our visibility as we're working on getting this new show off the ground. And Charlie, if people want to hear more from you, where can they connect with you online?
You can find me on Mastodon at mrcharlie@indieweb.social.
And you can follow me on Instagram and Threads. I'm at Graham Bauer, and on Mastodon, I'm at Graham Bauer at DULC.es. But that's it for this time. So until next time, bye-bye.